city's pension funds. Eddie. Phil, the setback comes once again from a judge who says the Chicago Park District pension agreement reached 4 years ago is unconstitutional. It's a deal Mayor Emanuel had called a model of city-union cooperation. But Circuit Court Judge Neil Cohen determined, among other things, the higher retirement age and reduced cost of living increases violate the key phrase in the Illinois Constitution that forbids diminished benefits. In his decision, Judge Cohen also orders the Park District to return the higher contributions members have made under the deal and tack on 3% interest, and also repay the difference from the lower disability payments, also with interest. Well, joining us tonight with his thoughts on the significance and potential taxpayer cost of this ruling is Ralph Martire, Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Ralph, thank you for coming back tonight. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having me on it.
I suppose there's no surprise in this ruling from Judge Cohen?
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, the judge just confirmed what we all knew, that the plain language of the Illinois Constitution explicitly prohibits any diminution or impairment of an established benefit in the pension system. And you can't do the impairment legislatively, and you can't enter into an agreement to do the impairment.
Which is what this was.
Which is what this was.
Now, the city hasn't really said what it's going to do moving forward from here, but if an appeal at this point would just be an exercise in futility given the decisions that the Supreme Court has already made.
It would be a waste of taxpayer money. I mean, really, the language in the Constitution is unambiguous, and even the constitutional history of the language, the drafters of the clause basically said, we're putting this in the Illinois Constitution to stop state and local governments from underfunding their pensions and then claiming they have such a big hole they need to cut benefits. I mean, literally, there's no room to focus on a benefit cut constitutionally in Illinois to address this issue. And I think the bigger picture is benefits haven't been the driver of the problem, the unfunded liability in our state. At the state level, at the local level, the driver of this problem has been the intentional underfunding of these systems for years and diverting revenue that should have gone into covering the cost of this future benefit to instead cover the cost of current services, which interestingly means we as taxpayers have consumed education, health, social services, public safety, in this case Park District services, without paying the full cost of those services in tax dollars for generations.
So what you're saying, and have said repeatedly on this show for many years, is the piper has to be paid at some point. What is this going to mean for taxpayers? And first of all, in terms of repayment, which the judge has ordered, with interest, has the center calculated what that's going to cost?
Yeah, it's going to be about $5 million to repay what was put in. It's going to increase the annual contribution by about $3.6 million. They're currently putting in about $40 million a year. That's 0.8% of their budget at the Park District. So it's fortunately an affordable cost in this instance, at least in the short run. Now,
but
long run, it's a different story, an unexpected one. The long story, and not just for this pension fund, but for the other pension funds the city of Chicago has to come to grips with, is far different. I mean, the unfunded liability for Chicago's other pension funds, when you look at those collectively, the police, the fire, the laborers, municipal, is not only significant, but the debt service ramp that's the current law for paying it is one that should cause taxpayers some concern. In 2014, the total contribution to all those systems for the city of Chicago was $479 million. In 2018, it was $1.18 billion. In 2020, that jumps by $500 million to $1.69 billion. In 2022, it almost doubles to $2.1 billion. And these backloaded payment plans, literally repaying what was borrowed to the systems, are what's straining resources and making taxpayers all nervous. What they have to do is come up with a far more rational plan for paying this debt. They can't get out of it. They owe it. And what we have found, even at the state level, where the state has $130 billion plus unfunded liability, if they put in a little bit more today than what the law requires and level those payments out over time through the magic of compounding interest by putting in more today, they save billions for taxpayers over time and still get the pension systems healthy and satisfy their obligations.
But of course, how much more do they have to put in now to reach that level, and how's it going to be sold to the taxpayers?
Well, I mean, one thing taxpayers just have to be aware of is they've been subsidized for generations. So they've been able to go to the parks, or they've had police and fire protection, or they've had clean streets, and they haven't had to pay the cost of that. In fact, the pension systems have been used like a credit card to subsidize a big part of that cost. We got to pay that back. So what we're telling the taxpayers is you really should have the current cost of your services covered by current revenue. You shouldn't rely on irresponsible practices like borrowing against long-term obligations that you owe the pension systems to fund services. So I think part of that context needs to get across. I think
But what you're saying, Ralph, is that the taxpayers, especially in Chicago, that and by extension Cook County, but this doesn't apply to Cook County. This particular contract, have to pay more when the taxes have gone up incredibly on a wide array of things, and including property taxes. Right. So are you saying get ready to pay even more?
Yes, but the good news is the sooner they get to a rational payment plan, right, a new level dollar amount that takes the pressure off down the road, the lesser the cost to taxpayers. So taxpayers should want this resolved sooner rather than later, because it saves them money, and significant money over time. I mean, that's number one. Number two, though, you really have to understand our state's tax policy in context of the rest of the nation. We have the 6th largest population, we have the 5th largest economy, and our total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income is 27th. That includes every tax and fee charged by any unit of state or local government as a percentage of our income. So we've historically been a very low tax state. We're still bottom half. There is some room to raise the revenue we need to fund these core services.
In what way?
Well, you know, the city's got very few options available to it. I mean, so the city's main revenue source is, of course, the property tax. Now, the city would be helped out tremendously if the state of Illinois got its fiscal house in order by fixing tax policy at the state level, because like in the military, these problems flow downhill. So if the state, for instance, were to have sound tax policy on its sales tax and expand its sales tax base to include consumer services, there's $300 million for the city overnight just from the sales tax base expansion. No change in the rate.
So when a mayoral spokesman after this decision said, we will work to find another responsible and fair funding plan, do you think that means tax increases, or do you think that they were going to try to concoct another type of agreement with the union?
You'll have to ask them. My crystal ball for reading the minds of elected officials and or administrative officials is kind of cloudy. It doesn't work. But what I do want to tell you is they can solve these problems, and they need some help from the state. And the state could certainly do a couple things tax policy-wise. Like I said, expand the sales tax base, the income tax. I mean, if we get a constitutional amendment to allow a graduated rate structure in the state of Illinois for our income tax, where lower rates apply to lower levels of income and higher rates at higher levels of income, we could raise significant revenue that would be shared, in fact, with local governments, and do it in a way that's fair to taxpayers. In fact, reduces tax burden for 90% of the state. We've modeled this out.
There has been so much resistance to any of this politically, and there has been every attempt at reform has seemed to have gone up in flames. Is there a nuclear option? This just let them go bankrupt and not have these pension funds?
That'd be so much more expensive for taxpayers, because then you go to a pay-as-you-go system. So you're paying for all the benefits for retired workers, as well as paying the cost for new workers. That is far more expensive to taxpayers than just actually coming up with a rational funding plan for the systems. So I think in taxpayers' best interest, what you do is solve the problem sooner rather than later. That reduces costs. You do it in a way that is sustainable over time and that allows enough tax revenue to be available to fund core services. It's doable. You just have to have honest conversations. And you have to do math.
Public employees probably don't want to hear it, but what if the Constitution were changed to mirror, for example, Rhode Island, which has seemed to have had pension reform that has stuck?
That would solve none of the problems we have today, because you can't have an ex post facto application of a constitutional change, meaning it would only impact, if they did it, new workers hired after the change in the Constitution. So all these existing debt problems, and they are debt, they are not benefit problems, all these existing debt problems would still have to be dealt with the way we've been saying they have to be dealt with. You'd have to re-amortize the debt. And I think the other important part of that is the benefits don't drive the cost and haven't driven these huge unfunded liabilities. So when they play around at the margins and deal with things like the benefit, they're missing the bullseye of the target. The bullseye of the target is the debt that's been incurred to these systems over time and finding a rational way to repay that debt.
Ralph Martiri, there's still a lot of work to be done, and maybe they'll listen to you, and maybe you'll have to come back and debate this issue once again. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me on.